Demonized and suppressed by the war on drugs, psychedelic medicines are making their return, and we're here to bring you the latest in scientific research and therapeutic practices involving psychedelic medicines from psilocybin to ayahuasca to DMT and beyond. This is the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. I'm Dr. Lynn Marie Morsky, your guide on this journey, and today we'll be discussing predicting and potentiating peak psychedelic experiences with Dr. Sam Gandy. Sam is a lifelong nature lover with a background and PhD in ecology and entomology. He's a researcher and science writer and has been fortunate enough to conduct ecological field research in various parts of the world. He's also a collaborator with the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London with a research interest in the capacity of psychedelic substances to influence people's connection with nature. Now, I found this episode fascinating because what we're talking about here, I mentioned peak psychedelic experiences, but another term for that is the mystical experience. And if you've read any of the psychedelic research, you may have noticed that there's a lot of correlation between having these peak or mystical psychedelic experiences and beneficial outcomes in treating certain conditions. And so what Sam has looked into in his research is how perhaps we can make it more likely that those kinds of experiences occur. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Now, before we get to Sam, of course, just a disclaimer that the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here is to be construed as medical or legal advice. And one last reminder that if you are a clinician and you'd like to learn even more about psychedelic medicines, please head over to psychedelicmedicineassociation.org, because all of us at the Psychedelic Medicine Association have a mission to educate clinicians around the world on these medicines so that when patients come and have issues that a psychedelic therapy could address, we all feel comfortable discussing and referring those patients to psychedelics when appropriate. All right, now without further ado. Thanks so much for joining us again today, Sam.
Thanks for having me back. It's nice to be speaking to you again, Lynn Marie.
Well, we had lots of positive feedback about your nature episode before, and I swear it has come up in so many subsequent episodes. We just had Fred Barnett on from Johns Hopkins, and he mentioned it, so we sent people back to your episode. He didn't mention the episode specifically, he mentioned your work, but I sent people back to your episode. But I was so stoked when you reached out and said you had this, because you had teased this paper at the end of our last episode together. And so we are today going to be talking about mystical experiences, the kinds of things that can predict them and possibly potentiate them, because we hear a lot in the psychedelic research about these mystical experiences and some of the benefits, or it's correlated with these beneficial outcomes. And so if people would like to learn more, thank you for coming on and being that person to guide us through this. So Sam, if we could start by you explaining a little bit about what a mystical experience is.
Yes. So a mystical experience, as it's sort of defined in the literature and sort of applied to both psychedelic and non-psychedelic experiences that people have, is an experience with a few different aspects or components. And these will include things such as a powerful emotional states of unconditional love, joy, peace, feeling of great reverence, sacredness, and awe, feelings of unity, both internal and external unity, and a noetic sense, a feeling that what is being revealed to you is authentic and true. And these experiences are experiences sort of along these lines have been sort of reported for centuries or millennia, and they seem to be a sort of a natural part of human beings. It seems to be an endogenous experience, and what makes psychedelics quite interesting is that they, under the right appropriate conditions and context, they can reliably elicit these experiences.
Thank you for that explanation. By the way, I'm going to correct myself real quickly because one week we had Rick Barnett and the next week we had Fred Barrett, and I just combined them into one person and called him Fred
Yeah,
Barnett. It's Fred Barrett. That's who was talking about
yeah,
it. Perhaps I need some mystical experiences in my life to get me thinking straightly again. But thank you for clarifying what that is. And what I'd love to know is if you could describe a little bit about the kinds of things that mystical experiences within these psychedelic states, and maybe even without, what kinds of associations there have been with some of the outcomes. Because, we've
yeah.
studied psychedelics for certain conditions, and it seems as though, like tobacco cessation or
Mhm.
depression. And it seems like there's always, here's the endpoint as far as how their depression or their tobacco cessation went, but there always seems to be some correlation where that mystical experience element is brought up. So if you could
Yeah,
talk a little bit about what they're finding in the research.
yeah, sure. So, well, it's interesting to note that mystical experiences, they crop up occasionally in a variety of different contexts. So, as part of extended meditation practice, following contact with nature, purely just spontaneously, seemingly a bolt out of the blue, and then as a result of psychedelic administration as well. And there's sort of, there's a lot of overlap, irrespective of the context that they emerge in. And so one of the sort of common things is this: there's a powerful enhancement that seems to be enduring of people's well-being levels. People report just feeling better as a result of their experiences. At the same time, there seems to be a sort of a shift towards greater pro-social and pro-environmental feelings. People's sort of awareness seems to sort of expand. So people tend to take in, other people and their wider environment sort of comes into focus a bit more than it maybe was before. There's also been associations with self-reported enhancements of creativity and other things. So there's, mystical experiences, even to sort of to healthy, seemingly healthy people can sort of yield some quite interesting effects. But then if you look at clinical populations, so people who've got, say, major depression or addiction, existential anxiety, so they may have a terminal cancer diagnosis and have sort of a fear of mortality around that. The mystical experiences associated with psychedelics seem to be important and powerful predictors of a clinical effect in all those different cases, and that's important to emphasize. In out of the sum total of all the psychedelic research that's yet being conducted, perhaps one of the clearest, most consistent findings to yet emerge from all of it is the importance of this experience in predicting long-term clinical outcomes and benefits in healthy populations as well. And this is really important. And this is partly why I wrote the paper, is that I think some clinicians, purely because of the label, because it's called mystical, and obviously not all scientists and clinicians are comfortable with that terminology. With that particular label. And this experience has been called many things: transformative, transcendental, religious, peak, unitive, mystical. It's sort of, and at the end of the day, we can argue about the semantics and the labels, but that's not that important. We can maybe come up with a more secular term such as peak or unitive that some clinicians, scientists are more comfortable with. But the more important thing here is that people do have these experiences quite reliably under the appropriate conditions, and they are really important sort of long term for people's health and well-being. So let's not sort of snub or dismiss them because the terminology might make us feel uncomfortable. Let's bring these experiences sort of into the light and a bit more like center stage, and work out how can we enhance their occurrence, and how can we work to enhance the long-term benefits that are associated with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. I love that you brought up the fact that because they're called mystical, it sounds a little woo woo, and then some clinicians may not focus on the importance. But the irony there is that that is the one thing that's really consistent, as you were saying, across a lot of this research, is that these experiences, whatever you call them, are very important.
Yeah.
And if we are looking to get the most benefit out of psychedelics and minimize, let's say, harm, uh, it seems like something we should definitely be focusing more on, as and especially the aspects that you had research is like, how do we potentiate these and make the most out of them and see if we can work toward, like, not every psychedelic journey is guaranteed to come with a mystical
No.
experience. What can we do that may make that more likely?
Well, yeah, and certainly, and but I guess there's also a case to be made. We don't, while highlighting their importance, we also don't need to be like overly overemphasized. You can still have valuable therapeutic or beneficial psychedelic experience without that experience occurring. There's sort of more, yeah, they're bringing other things to the table potentially. Um, but yeah, it's definitely this aspect of psychedelics and this potentiality of them definitely sort of really warrants attention
Yeah, and
and care. And yeah,
I appreciate you bringing up the fact that, like, let's not set an expectation that, like, if you don't have a mystical experience, nothing happened, right? Thank you for
no,
for adding that.
no, I think that's important. I think, obviously some people, when they approach these substances, particularly if they've got mental health conditions such as depression or addiction, they might, yeah, we need to temper expectations so that people don't overly expect coming into their psychedelic experience. So if they don't quite have the experience or the effects that they were maybe hoping for, they're not too sort of set back by that. So it's sort of, yeah, we need to be kind of grounded in sort of with regards to expectations and hopes. I think.
I agree with you. And before we get into the things that may predict or potentiate a mystical experience, would you mind talking a little bit about the possibilities of having a tumultuous type of mystical experience?
Yes. So yeah, I kind of touched on this in the introduction of the paper because I think it's important to mention that occasionally a mystical experience may provoke a spiritual emergency, as it has been termed, or a spiritual crisis. And this is essentially, it comes about where people will have this, very powerful experience that kind of quite drastically and suddenly and perhaps jarringly alters their perspectives and their life value system and how they sort of perceive themselves and the world. And for some people, this might be quite a jarring and sudden event, and it might not leave that much space to sort of adapt to those changes. And I would say this isn't a common occurrence by any means, but it does occasionally happen with powerful spiritual or mystical experiences. So it's something that sort of needs to be sort of kept in mind. Um, as well, there's potential issues here. So, in a clinical sense, the mystical experience needs really quite sensitive and tender handling, because it's been sort of, the case has been made that yeah, the way clinicians working with people having these experiences interpret those experiences could potentially have biases that then sort of spill over to the person who's had that experience. And other researchers have made the rightful case, like clinicians working with people with psychedelics should be careful about projecting their own spiritual or religious views onto them. And that might include putting religious iconography and objects into the session room. Seemingly subtle things like that could potentially alienate people or prime people in a certain way. So there's a case, some will sort of infer from that, well, maybe we should just strip away any religious or spiritual aspects to sort of the context of these experiences, and maybe that's the safest way to play it. But then other researchers will argue, well, hang on a sec, that in fact could sort of diminish the effectiveness of psychedelic psychotherapy. It might not be the best way of working with people who've had these powerful ontological shifts. Just sort of this kind of dismissing it slightly and sort of without really delving into it. So yeah, it needs careful sort of hand. And then there's also, I should add, the issue of the scales used to assess mystical experiences. They themselves have been flagged as maybe having a few issues, like they could potentially prime people in a certain way. They could maybe be not the most conducive to people who say are atheist or lack a spiritual connection. They might kind of slightly exclude those people from the from sort of really connecting with the scale items. So yeah, even measuring these experiences is kind of, it's sensitive and requires kind of careful thought. But one way that's been kind of talked about in the paper is like, well, okay, if there's issues around religious or spiritual framing these experiences in terms of priming people, in terms of the ethics around that is sort of shady, but then maybe stripping all the sort of spiritual context away is perhaps that might not be the most ethical thing to do either. And it's like, well, how do we navigate this sort of minefield? But one of the ways that I suggest that's sort of inspired by a colleague at Synthesis Institute, where I used to work, and Dan Keeman, and he has this kind of interfaith approach that sort of, it kind of emphasizes transparency on the therapist's part. So they will sort of, they will be transparent with their own beliefs and their own views. And it sort of, allows the kind of the space for anyone to sort of like, I guess, contextualize that experience, but without it being framed kind of externally. So they're given the support to sort of integrate that experience on their own terms without sort of too much outside sort of interference.
That makes sense. And for anybody who's listening and who really wants to get down the rabbit hole of the pitfalls of some of the research, we did an episode with Matt Johnson that you referenced in your paper,
Mm-hmm.
Pitfalls of psychedelic research or psychedelic medicine. Check that out. I think it's from September. So thank you for calling attention to those again. He went into those in depth and it was a great discussion. Let's get into some of the predictors of psychedelic mystical experiences that you mentioned in your paper. We just last week did our podcast with Fred Barrett. I will get it right this time.
Yeah.
And he had done a paper on, aspects of setting. And I see here set and setting is the first thing that you discuss as one of the predictors of these mystical experiences. Can you talk a little bit about how those are related?
Yes. So I think of all the different sort of factors, set and setting is sort of the top of the pile in terms of importance. And it's sort of, there's been psychedelic research over quite a few decades now, and sort of things have been learned over that time. And it seems that, well, it makes sense, I guess, that if people feel safe and secure and comfortable, that's important, because it can help facilitate states of surrender and acceptance. So surrender is tied to feelings of trust and safety. You're more liable to feel like you can fully let go when you feel in a secure, safe setting and situation. So that's one aspect where the setting is important, and the clinical way of doing it is quite good in terms of making sure people are in a safe, contained, secure, and comfortable setting. And I would say another important aspect, and something to sort of have in mind from the clinical approach to how psychedelics are used, is people tend to, whatever side of the Atlantic it is, because obviously that the approach is very much sort of being influenced by I guess sort of both sides. What the approach is very much an inwards looking and inwards focused way of doing it. So people have been primed to kind of go inside and shine their light into the darkest recesses of their mind and look for any shadows or monsters or anything that might be there that they can sort of confront and sort of ask as to why, what are you doing in here? What can I learn from you? So people have been sort of primed to sort of go inside their minds, but also they are wearing headphones, they are wearing eye shades, they're lying down on a couch or a bed. So that sort of situation, that context is kind of on all fronts is designed to kind of like nudge people's awareness inwards, because obviously if you're lying down with your eyes closed and you've got a carefully orchestrated playlist that's taking you through the various phases of that experience, your setting is essentially less so the actual room but more the inside of your head, really. And the setting is acting as a container, as a safety security container, but it's not playing much of a direct role in the experience actually beyond that. And people's setting, if you want, it tends to be sort of their own internal mind or brain.
I like that you bring attention to that because, I'm one of the eye shades, headphones, all that people, so that my setting really doesn't matter once I feel safe enough. Like you said, if your setting feels safe, then you can go ahead and recreate your own setting in your head internally. And I think that's a great point. Like you and I had that nature discussion, and it's like nature is amazing as long as it's a safe nature environment, right? Like edge of a
Yes.
cliff, not the safest nature
Yes.
environment, but
Yeah.
once you've got the rest of it set up and you can then like kind of let go and go as internally as you want.
Yeah.
I think that's really worthwhile to point out. Now, the next thing on your list, I'm very curious about, and it's kind of like a wild swing differently into the
Yeah.
very specific, but let's talk a little bit about how drug dosage can have an impact on
Mm.
that mystical experience.
So yeah, this is I think after set and setting, this is probably the next most important or next best, most well documented factor, I would say, that sort of predicts the occurrence of these experiences. So there's been quite a lot of research that's, the Johns Hopkins team kind of got the ball rolling here, but there's been sort of more work on this side of the Atlantic as well now. And yeah, I think sort of some of the researchers got quite keyed in to the actual very specific dosages that seem to sort of be optimal. So yeah, it seems so one of the common clinical dosages of psilocybin, say, at least on this side of the Atlantic, is 25 milligrams. And it used to be that the dosage of the drug was it was assessed via people's body weight, and you would get a dosage depending on you. But it's been found that body weight is not a reliable predictor actually of your response to psilocybin. So they tend to just give a standard dosage now of 25 milligrams. And what's quite interesting is that some of the work conducted by Johns Hopkins over a few different studies over the years, actually, they sort of compared a range of different psilocybin dosages, and I think they looked at sort of 20 and 30 milligrams, and they found that at 20 milligrams there was it was a reliable kind of elicitor of mystical experiences, but then once you got to 30, there was a greater chance of mystical experiences occurring, but at that dosage, chances of adverse reactions such as like feelings of strong anxiety and panic and stuff also start to emerge as well. So it's important to say that, just kind of from a safety angle, that although there's a fairly sort of strong linear response, response of of dosage on the possibility of mystical experiences beyond a certain dosage point, the chances of adverse reactions also start to become a real issue. So that's actually why the dosage of 25 milligrams is, I think, sort of preferentially selected, because it's kind of a nice middle ground. It's not up to the 30 level where you're slightly sort of at higher risk of these adverse reactions, but it's a little bit higher than the 20. So it's kind of that sweet spot, Goldilocks zone for people where, you're hopefully it's going to be the best of both worlds.
I want to clarify that you are most likely speaking about 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry, I should say. So yes, 25 milligrams of the pure synthetic lab-made substance or
Okay.
essence.
There we
Mushroom.
go.
Yeah.
In case we
Yeah.
had people, not that we were encouraging any illicit drug use, but
No,
somebody's out there with like a dried mushroom saying 25
no,
milligrams.
that's very good to clarify.
Now, on that same front, talking about dosage, if you could touch a little bit about how absorption may change things.
Yes. So this is an ever interesting factor that sort of it's cropped up in quite a few different studies. And so trait absorption is an aspect of personality that's similar to openness to experience to some degree. And it sort of encompasses one's ability to switch or engage their total attention, be that imaginative, cognitive, emotive, into their own sort of internal mental arena. Not necessarily internal, though, because it can also be kind of projected outwards into the external world. So you can be deeply absorbed by nature as well. And it's been found in non-psychedelic studies. It's your level of trait absorption. So there's a scale that you can sort of ask you questions to sort of probe your absorption levels. And people who rate more highly on this scale are sort of they're much more likely to have spontaneous, mystical, and spiritual experiences, sort of outside of a psychedelic context. But when considered in the context of psychedelic studies, it's also been shown that people who rate high in absorption are more likely to have mystical experiences. And this is interesting because although it's considered a trait, and rather than a state, so there's state and trait absorption, but in the personality context, it tends to be considered as a trait, and a trait usually refers to something that's fairly like fixed and rigid. It doesn't tend to sort of the view is it maybe doesn't fluctuate that much, but looking at the kind of research, it seems at least in the short term, it is possible to influence absorption. So things like hypnosis, flow states, immersive and comfortable settings, hypnagogic states, and listening to music all sort of key into or heighten states of absorption. And it seems as well that there might be a kind of a bi-directional link between spiritual practice and meditation and absorption as well. So people who have more absorption might sort of have a predilection for spiritual practice and meditative activities, but also there could be a training effect, so that over time people can actually elevate their trait absorption. But it seems it's an important factor to consider, and it's something that might be worth exploring, because in some studies it has been shown it's possible to heighten it in the short term, and it's sort of associated with things like greater experiences of awe in the short term. So this might be something to kind of look at in more detail, because if you could potentially sort of enhance this prior to or during a psychedelic session, there could be a synergy there potentially.
Interesting. Very interesting. That is, absorption was a new one to me. So thank you for explaining that more in detail. Now, this one is very interesting to me because as somebody who, you've been involved in setting up research trials, etc. Like it, I'm sure that the drug type, what drug we're going to choose to investigate is got to be a huge, it factor in whether
Hmm.
there will be an outcome, but whether there will be maybe a mystical experience that helps lead to that outcome. So if you could talk a little bit about how the drug type, the drug that is actually ingested, has an effect.
Yes, sure. So it's important to state just from the outset that mystical experiences have been broadly associated with all different types of psychedelic. It's something it's quite unique to psychedelic substances. It's something that's quite special to them is their propensity to trigger mystical states compared to other drugs. But there might well be kind of variation among these different substances. I mean, it's important to emphasize that the kind of vast bulk of modern research has been using psilocybin, so there is a slight biasing of psilocybin because of that, because it's the sort of like it's taking center stage in the modern renaissance. um, and it seems that you know if the setting is optimized, and particularly with the Hopkins studies, it's important to emphasize that people were recruited who were spiritually interested and active, and that's an important factor, I think, in terms of predicting mystical experiences. And people were obviously supported, and some of the studies have used supplementary kind of spiritual practices alongside as well. um, but it's important to sort of to note, the psychedelic 5-methoxy DMT is definitely an interesting substance to sort of highlight here. Now, it's important just to say there's been a lot less research using it overall than psilocybin. There's definitely more a growing amount of work being done on it now, but it's kind of a little bit behind psilocybin. So there's less overall data, but the data that's there shows that when it's used in a supportive context, it can predict mystical experiences, and it's sort of like 3/4 of cases, over that in two separate studies that have been done so far. And so and yeah, there was another study kind of comparing mystical experiences elicited by psilocybin and 5-methoxy DMT, and even sort of the medium dose range of 5-meo DMT predicted mystical experiences at like a similar level to the 30 milligram dosage of psilocybin I mentioned earlier in the Hopkins trials. So it seems to be a particularly reliable and direct hotline, if you will, to the kind of core mystical unitive state, which is very interesting, but also warrants it requires like very careful handling indeed because of that power. It's on a kind of it's almost like a foot above things like psilocybin and LSD. So because of that power, it needs extra sensitive and tender handling, I would say.
I would definitely agree. We did a number of episodes on 5-meo DMT, and looking forward to seeing more research, like you said, because it is such a powerful one. And shout out to everybody out there who is doing the research and trying to increase the standards of safety that go along with that super
Yes.
powerful substance. Next on your list is one that I think most of us have heard about, and so very accessible to the vernacular and what we're used to talking about in psychedelic experiences, which is intention. How can setting that intention, or how does the intention you set you up for possibly having one of these mystical experiences?
Yes. So this is it seems to be quite an important aspect of entering into a psychedelic experience is having that prior, some kind of prior intention, particularly if it's sort of emotive or spiritual in nature. Seems to be an important predictor of mystical experiences occurring. And I mean, that's interesting, and it's important to keep in mind, indigenous groups who use psychedelics, they don't tend to use them frivolously or without intent. There's usually an intent to which they're being sort of applied. And Yes, so yeah, entering to the experience with an emotional intent or with a spiritual motivation seems to sort of predict greater likelihood of mystical experiences.
And the next thing you mentioned, the last two things on the list were surrender state and acceptance, and you kind of had alluded to those earlier as things that seem to be set up for with the setting that you choose initially. Like the proper setting allows easier acceptance, allows you to surrender more. So if you could elaborate on that just a bit.
Yes, sure. So yeah, the ability to let go and surrender. So this is the voluntary release of goals, preferences, constructs, habits going into a psychedelic session. Um, Seems to be an important predictor of mystical experiences. So one of the therapeutic mantras that seems to be commonly applied again on both sides of the Atlantic by different groups is trust, let go, be open. And that's sort of encapsulating that, just surrender and let it unfold as it will. And I mean, actually, what I just described there, that's kind of slightly blending into acceptance, actually, because acceptance, and so there's the sort of similar yet kind of distinct. Acceptance is the ability to allow events to unfold without attempting to control them, and so acceptance is tied to mindfulness. So it's possible that cultivating mindfulness could be a way of then cultivating greater acceptance. Certain forms of therapy, such as acceptance and commitment therapy, accept, connect, and embody therapy, center on the importance of acceptance, and so yes, and having a secure, safe, comfortable setting is more likely to sort of be conducive to these states. I mean, I do mention as well, I mean, because it's one thing to sort of, I guess, tell people to surrender, but then it's another thing to actually have the, in the moment, the sort of desire or ability to do so. And perhaps there might be a case to be made from maybe it's something that can be trained through experience. And I kind of touch on holotropic breath work. Sort of centers on the importance of surrender for those experiences, and because it's obviously a voluntary altered state of consciousness that you can kind of modulate by breathing, so you can kind of step on and off the bus as you might like, unlike when you take a psychedelic. So there could be potential for sort of training or learning to surrender and let go using that approach, perhaps before then taking the sort of plunge, I guess, with a psychedelic experience.
I love that you brought that up because I work with a number of, not work with directly, but I hear from a number of facilitators that if something like, 5-MeO DMT is a little shocking and people are having a hard time letting go or accepting or surrendering to something that may be that powerful, they start with something like, can we do a low dose ketamine? Let's work our way up to, breath work is a great suggestion, like something that is a much less time and energy and potentially kind of like spiritual investment
Yes.
than meeting God tomorrow. Like what can we start with that is, like you said, when can I hop on and off the bus? Can I do it at my own pace? Can I do it at a lower pace? I think that's a great suggestion.
Yes. Well, it's interesting what you just said as well about using a low dose of ketamine or something else, because it reminds it's using having actually lower doses, having a lower dose psychedelic session before you then have a high dose. That seems also to be conducive for people are less likely to have adverse reactions when they've had that low dose experience before. They're sort of, I guess, a bit more familiar with that altered state at that level. It seems like they're then more able to sort of let go and surrender. So yeah, that's another thing just to sort of to have in mind there, I think.
Nice. Well, that is good to know for those who are maybe newer to the field. Now, let's move on to, you mentioned three possible potentiators of mystical
Mm.
experiences, and these are fantastically interesting. Let's start with everybody's friend, music.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, it's sort of music it plays a very important role. It's important to say in psychedelic sessions and in a therapeutic context, and it's been sort of referred to as the hidden therapist because of its central pivotal role. And yeah, I mean, and psychedelic session playlists tend to be quite carefully designed, so there doesn't tend to be familiar vocal music, and it seems, and that's interesting because this harks back to one of the, I guess, the negative correlates of mystical experience is hearing language. So that could be either the speech of someone talking to you, but I also think lyrics, recognizable lyrics in music, they sort of, yeah, that's hearing that is going to kind of get the analytical circuits of your brain kind of whirring, and that's sort of maybe, yeah, not going to be helpful to have when it comes to having an experience like this. So music has a kind of a multi-dimensional effect. So it can enhance, it's been shown to enhance feelings of wonder and transcendence, and these are sort of core facets of the mystical experience. And it seems as well that different, so the particular aspects of the music seem to be conducive to mystical states as well. So one study kind of surveyed all these different treatment providers and clinicians who've used psilocybin or psilocybin fungus on a minimum of 50 occasions, and sort of probed this population to find out what music have you found in your kind of given, or the sum of your experiences to be sort of supportive and conducive. And yeah, music with regular, predictable, formulaic phrase structure and orchestration, a feeling of continuous movement and forward motion, and lower perceptual brightness when compared to peak music. So yeah, that kind of gives a bit of a kind of insight into, yeah, there's quite a few different aspects of music to kind of consider all at the same time, about, and sort of, and as well as that, types of music as well may also have an effect. There was one interesting study, bearing in mind it was pretty small. It was a sample size of 10, and because of that, probably that small size, there wasn't significant differences found between the two groups, but they compared classical music, which until quite recently was kind of more of the standard go-to, at least I think on sort of, yeah, your side of the Atlantic maybe, but they compared it more to sort of world music, particularly emphasizing a strong overtonal signature. So things like Tibetan singing bowls and gongs, didgeridoo, chimes, bell, human voice overtone singing. So again, obviously it's fine for the human vocals and voice to be involved there, but because it's not sort of producing, and also music with other languages in that the brain can't kind of latch onto, I think works quite well. But throat singing, vocalizing like that, totally, yeah, kind of above board. And yeah, it found the kind of more overtone based world music seemed to be more predictive of mystical experiences. Even though, as I say, it was a small study, it shows like, yeah, we need to kind of pay more attention to the types of music that we use here, and then there'll be individual differences probably as well to consider.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I love every time we get into that discussion. I think we discussed that with Fred as well. It's like, thank you for re-emphasizing that lyrics are a little bit distracting. I remember one, I had a guided session and the person put on that. It's like a piece of music that has, I think, Alan Watts speaking in it. And I'm like, please,
Yeah.
please not turn this off. I'm not like, you don't want to be, if you're trying to get mystical, the last thing you want to do is like, I was brought back into like a lecture hall,
Yes.
Please don't make me
Yeah.
process something lectured at me
No.
right now.
No, I agree, and I'm all for Alan Watts. I like hearing what Alan Watts has to say, and I like the sound of his voice saying it as well. But yes, no, I agree. It's sort of, when you're in that experience, it definitely will, yeah, potentially, well, a few different things. I think it can kind of get your analytical brain whirring, which is not, I don't think, helpful. There's this aspect. That kind of can negatively predict mystical experience, called mental barriers. And this is where you sort of enter the experience with kind of a I guess in some senses, overly rational, analytical way of viewing things. And if you enter the experience like that, that's the potential block on mystical experiences happening. And I feel like, yeah, too much sort of language circuit activation going on in the brain is going to sort of, well, it's going to get you in a more analytical sort of mind state, but at the same time, it's going to maybe push your emotions in a certain direction as well, rather than having more, I guess, more spacious, ambient worldy music. It's sort of, it's less pushy in terms of how it's wanting you to feel. It's leaving you to sort of feel as you want to it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I like that. I like that description. Next on the list of these potentiators is meditation and spiritual practices.
Yes, I think, yeah. So I think this is really interesting, and particularly when it comes to the subject of, like, how do we, if we have these experiences, how do we, I guess, prolong or extend some of the benefits, or over time. And it seems like experiences such as yoga and meditation in particular, there seems to be sort of a strong link to show that prior meditation practice before a psychedelic experience can predict, it can predict the occurrence of mystical experiences that occur. It as well, so it predicts the occurrence of mystical experiences, but it seems to deepen and augment some of the benefits one experiences as a result of their mystical experience, as well. And it also seems to extend some of the psychological benefits. So yeah, on kind of, they sort of bring a lot to the table here. So I think there's one particularly interesting. Well, no, there's some great studies here actually, but one study that doesn't get talked about that much. I think they've actually made a documentary on it, which might be interesting. But it was a study conducted in the Swiss Alps by a Swiss research team, and they took experienced Zen Buddhist meditators on a 5-day alpine meditation retreat in the Swiss Alps. So it's quite a beautiful setting. And what's quite interesting is that obviously it's not the clinical setting; it's kind of its own thing. And took these experienced Buddhist meditators and gave them either a placebo, or a specifically weighed dose of about, I think, around 21 milligrams was the average dose of psilocybin. And what was interesting in that sort of, 95%, so 19 out of 20 people in this study who received the psilocybin had a complete mystical experience. And that's the sort of, that's the highest mystical experience ratings in the scientific literature that I'm aware of. And so, it's kind of, that's hinting that, that sort of prior meditation experience, and also the practice as well, there was a synergy there. And the researchers observed that the meditation practice during the retreat, it seemed to sort of amplify some of the beneficial potentials of psilocybin in terms of the prolonged effects on well-being, the possibility of mystical experiences, but as well, it seemed to kind of buffer against some of the potential dysphoric or negative adverse reactions as well, interestingly. So there was a compelling synergy in the moment, actually. So not just during, but actually in the experience itself, there seemed to be a synergy. Yes, and it seemed that the meditation practice was associated with more likely to predict oceanic boundlessness, and that falls under the umbrella of the mystical experiences, particularly concerned with the kind of unitive states of unity that people experience, which arguably is the kind of the cornerstone of the mystical experience itself. And people with meditation experience, or with an ongoing practice, they seem more liable to sort of report states of oceanic boundlessness tied to the mystical experience. But even so, outside of that context, so obviously that these were like seasoned Zen Buddhist veterans who'd been, probably meditating or having a practice going back years and years in some cases. But it's important to sort of highlight that even shorter term practice can also appears to have a powerful synergy. And so one of the Johns Hopkins studies that was published a few years ago looked at sort of, it compared different groups that had high support and sort of low support, but it also looked as an add-on to that spiritual practices as well. And these sort of varied from like a journaling practice to daily awareness practices, so using mantras, and also just more kind of, I guess, traditional mindfulness meditation practice as well. And people had some freedom, to pick and mix those practices that resonated, but they started them a few months before, 1 to 2 months prior to their psilocybin or placebo session, and then they kept them up for 6 to 8 months afterwards. And similar sort of echoes to the previous study, but people with the spiritual practice alongside the psychedelic dosing, they reported greater mystical experiences, and the overall intensity and profundity of those experiences was also enhanced. So the attribution of meaning and also enhanced spirituality to that experience were enhanced as a result of that spiritual meditative practice alongside. And as well, it also seemed to augment and enhance some of the psychological shifts and benefits associated with the mystical experience were also enhanced by the spiritual practice. So it seems there's synergy and sort of overlap on a few different fronts actually, and it's also interesting to know that some meditation practices have been associated with enhanced openness. And so openness, sort of similar to absorption, predicts the occurrence of mystical experiences. So it's possible that spiritual practices such as meditation could, by enhancing openness, they can increase the possibility of a mystical experience happening. But we know also that mystical experiences themselves increase openness. So a spiritual and meditative practice could both increase your propensity to a mystical experience, but also synergize and sort of sustain the post-mystical experience elevation in openness as well, potentially. So, I think there's a lot more potential work here to be done on how sort of spiritual practices, in particular meditation, but also yoga and other things, how they sort of might kind of synergize with psychedelic administration.
Well, I love what you illustrated, which is like kind of like this upward spiral. Like one can increase openness, then openness increases the possibility of mystical experience, which therefore, like it just seems like one builds on the other in all of a positive direction.
I think that's a nice way of putting it. And there's been a few other studies that sort of, I think was it Roger Walsh who did a study, and this was I think in the 1970s. But it seems to a certain degree that psychedelics are particularly, or can be really quite effective when they're, rather than just used as a standalone thing, if they're used as part of a sort of pre-existing practice of some kind, they can, in the same way, like when they're applied as therapy agents, they're effectively they're amplifying the therapy. That's the sort of basic theory on how they're working. Whereas, it seems like they can kind of synergize and build on, other like spiritual or meditative practices. And another thing just to say about the experience of ego dissolution or the loss of subjective self identity, that's sort of considered a key aspect or predictor of the mystical experience is that sort of that temporary loss of self. And it seems as well, again, there's a positive sort of relationship between psychedelic use and ego dissolution, and that then can predict greater desire to pursue meditation if someone's experienced it in a psychedelic experience. So yeah, there's a few. They seem to sort of, there seems to be a few interesting reciprocal synergies that can occur here potentially.
I like it. And I think let's round out the episode by adding on potentially another synergy which you are most associated with, which would be the nature-based settings of psychedelic experiences.
Yes, yeah. Last but not least, yeah. So I mean, obviously, things like meditation, spiritual practices, and music have obviously they've kind of had attention. I'm not the first person to sort of point out their importance in a psychedelic context, but it seems that nature-based settings are slightly more neglected. I feel so. I wanted to sort of like shed some light on them, because if we think about it, one way of looking at the clinical setting around psychedelics is we've built that setting from the ground up. And obviously, indigenous groups have long known the importance of set and setting. We might have come up with the term in the 60s or whatever, but the other groups of humans were clued into that knowledge centuries or millennia ago. We weren't, we were rediscovering what has already been known by some people for a long time. But in doing so, we kind of, the clinical setting, we've learned through quite a trial and error. If you go back to the 1950s and some of the very ethically dubious psychedelic dosings that were going on then in really quite poor, when we didn't really know, we considered these drugs psychotomimetic. We thought they induced psychosis and mental illness because of the settings were so conducive to those reactions rather than more sublime spiritual mystical states. So, but I say that because rather than obviously needing to build the setting from the ground up so that it's secure and safe and comfortable and maximizes that internal journey, nature-based settings seem to be quite conducive to mystical and spiritual states just inherently. So there's a lot of research. Well, there's quite a few studies highlighting how natural settings can elicit spiritual feelings and mystical experiences. And it's important as well, I think, here just to quickly highlight Albert Hoffman and his own sort of view, because his work and actually his motivation to pursue a career in chemistry to sort of world-changing sort of effect was motivated by his own experiences. And in his words, he said, "I had profound and visionary encounters with nature, and this was long before I conducted my initial experiments with LSD. Indeed, my first experiences with LSD were very reminiscent of these early mystical encounters I had had as a child in nature." So you see that it's even possible to have these experiences without drugs. And we know that nature-based settings they are conducive to eliciting meditative, reflective mind states. They can promote absorption. They can promote awe quite reliably, and awe has been tied to the mystical experiences that psychedelics can produce, and awe itself is tied to spiritual feelings. Feelings of interconnectedness are a core part of the mystical experience. And when you're in a natural setting, it's that awareness of interconnectedness, of being part of a larger web of life, are particularly prominent and sort of apparent there. So I think there's a case to be made that nature-based settings can sort of help bolster some of the core feelings such as awe and wonder and interconnectedness that are core aspects of the mystical experience. So I feel like, and just using psychedelics with the intent actually to connect with nature, when we're talking about motivations and intent earlier, just sort of using them with that intent has also been associated with greater chances of mystical experiences and also greater well-being scores. So yeah, I feel like there's more work to be sort of done here, kind of examining the potential contribution of nature-based settings to psychedelic administration. Because yeah, as of now, there's been barely any work specifically looking at it.
Well, I hope that there is much more done because, like you said, as many of the as if these mystical experiences may be such an important part of these outcomes, it's great to have more research into these possible things that we can layer and synergize together to make those experiences more likely to happen. If not, again, caveat, they're not required, but
Yes.
but if we could ease toward them with some simple additions like nice, safe, nature-based settings, why not?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, it's yeah, there's a variety of different factors and different sort of avenues here that we can potentially explore further because yeah, I feel like this isn't something we should try and we should shy away from or sweep under the rug again just because we're uncomfortable with the label of pride or the potential implications. It's too important for that, and and just out of basic, wanting to, be a part of scientific progress, I think it would limit that if we were to sort of, yeah, dismiss or snub or brush under the rug these types of experiences. So yeah, I think if we want to maximize the potential beneficial application of psychedelics, then this is an important area we need to consider and work on.
I am in 100% agreement and very grateful that you have put a focus on this and put this paper together to get us all starting thinking in these directions. Sam, thank you so much for coming on. Can you tell people where they can find you and your work if they'd like to learn more?
Um, yeah, sure. So so I'm kind of on the internet in a few places. I've not really got a specific. I've been told I should get like a website that's kind of like keeps me more centralized. But I'm on Twitter at Samwise Gandy. My ResearchGate, Sam Gandy ResearchGate. I've got my papers are sort of all on there if anyone wants to have a delve. But sort of, yeah, and then there's various different podcasts and other bits and pieces sort of peppered over the interwebs.
Well, thank you. For somebody who wants to check out your, I think this is the first time we've thrown out a ResearchGate reference. So shout out to ResearchGate. That's where you can find most of the lovely podcast guests we have. If anybody's interested in delving into there, so thank you for bringing that up as a resource. That if anybody wants to check out, basically anybody who's done research. So if you want to learn more about Sam's research, head over to ResearchGate or follow him on Twitter. Sam, thank you again so much for coming on and sharing your research with us.
Thank you. It's been fun. Thanks a lot for having me.
Absolutely. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time. Thanks so much for listening to the Psychedelic Medicine Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave a rating or review as it helps others find the show. And if you'd like to learn more, you can find the show notes at plantmedicine.org/podcast, and there's information for clinicians at psychedelicmedicineassociation.org. Our incredible music was by the one and only Porangi. We'll see you next time.